Welcome back to the Argentina Project podcast here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I am Benjamin Gadan, and I am thrilled to have back on our podcast Todd Martinez.
Good to be back.
Todd, as you might recall, has been on the podcast before discussing Argentina, which he covers for Fitch Ratings in New York. He is also the principal analyst for Uruguay for Fitch and travels regularly to Montevideo, Uruguay for research. This is a special edition of our podcast because we're going to have a guest host, Nicolás Saldias, an Uruguayan-Canadian researcher at the Wilson Center who follows closely macro issues in Uruguay. He is going to lead our conversation with Todd.
So I have a couple of questions that I want to ask you about Uruguay. The first one I want to ask is regarding Uruguay's ability to weather the regional recessions recently. So as you may know, the country avoided recession while Argentina and Brazil entered one in 2016. I was wondering, what do you think that is? Why do you think that is? And what does it tell us about the Uruguayan economy in a regional context?
Yeah, sure. I think, first of all, Uruguay has certainly made great strides from where it was 15 years ago in terms of developing its resilience in what's a very difficult neighborhood. I think probably the most important advance is the channels of financial contagion that used to be very relevant are no longer such. It used to be that Argentines had a very large share of deposits in the Uruguayan banking system and that Uruguayan banks had some exposure to Argentina as well. Nowadays, those sorts of exposure are very much reduced. And I think a good example of that is the Argentine blanqueo. The tax amnesty led to a lot of withdrawals of deposits from Uruguayan banks, but it really led to any sort of macro ramifications for Uruguay at all. So that's a good example. I think tourism is probably going to be the most relevant channel. I think we'll see this next tourist season if Argentina's big depreciation and volatility could affect tourism inflows. On one hand, Uruguay is a high-end tourism destination for a lot of Argentines that have houses there and savings in dollars, might be somewhat resilient given that. But on the other hand, those people might spend less money and middle-class visitors might not come quite as much. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But the goods export channel is also much reduced to Argentina as well. So I think what that says is that Uruguay, yes, it's limited those channels of financial contagion quite a bit, and it's diversified its export markets to all sorts of markets throughout the world. China's the big one now. You hear about Algeria becoming a more relevant destination for some Uruguayan products, Russia. So I think all in all, Uruguay, while still in a tricky neighborhood, has done a good job, building that sort of resilience. The negative side, though, is I think those two countries really still do matter quite a bit for Uruguay. One thing that we've highlighted is that Uruguay's national accounts are pretty out of date. And if you strip out one sector, telecommunications, that's just due to measurement issues, has a big weight in nominal GDP. Uruguay has actually not performed nearly as well as the headline numbers suggest, and perhaps did have a few years of contraction. So if the GDP series were rebased and updated, I think it would show that Uruguay is still resilient, but not perhaps as quite a rosy picture as the current data suggests over the past few years.
So in this current financial crisis that Argentina and the emerging markets are weathering right now, you are positive that Uruguay can pull through as a result of all these differences in the channels of contagion?
Yeah, I think in terms of the real economy, in terms of goods exports, Uruguay has a very diversified set of export markets. So, some countries in particular might be demanding less, but the export sector has proven pretty agile in finding alternative markets to send their goods and everything. In terms of the financial contagion, there's already been a significant depreciation of the peso. But that's not super relevant for the private sector. They don't have a lot of debt to begin with. While there is a relatively high share of debt in dollars, it's largely to people who have income in dollars. So there's not a lot of currency mismatches that stand to lead to any sort of big macro distress. That said, the biggest currency mismatch in the Uruguayan economy is the government's own debt. It's still 50% denominated in dollars. So the government is set to see that debt to GDP ratio rise and its interest costs rise as a share of its revenues. So, I think the exchange rate channel remains the most important for Uruguay as a dollarized economy. It'll affect public debt metrics, like I just said. It'll also lead to pass-through into inflation and just leads to an overall confidence impact. Even though a weaker currency helps the export sector, that's more of a medium-term benefit. In the near term, it could stand to weigh on confidence and consumption. And I think we're already seeing that this year. And growth forecasts have been slashed quite a bit.
So you signaled already that Uruguay's economy is not doing as well as the front or the headline statistics show. But the narrative in the country is that there's jobless growth, that the economy is growing, but there just isn't employment growth. And since 2015, unemployment has gone up. So I'm wondering if you could flesh out a little bit more about what's happening in Uruguay's labor market.
Yeah, just to elaborate on that, we don't think, of course, that this is a case where any sort of national accounts data is being, intentionally changed or anything. It's just a bit out of date, and that it's overweighting the share of the telecommunications sector, which eventually when they rebase, that will go away and could show a somewhat lower average growth rate over the past several years. When you strip out this one small sector, telecommunications, it shows that GDP has not risen really from 2014. And so that metric, GDP x telecommunications, is more consistent with other indicators of the real economy that you referenced, namely employment. There's been net job destruction since 2014. The unemployment rate remains high, and that's despite a lot of people having left the labor force. And then you hear about a lot of businesses having closed. Other anecdotal evidence of, the real economy in Uruguay actually struggling quite a bit in a way that those headline GDP numbers don't suggest. So yeah, I think this is very much a case in Uruguay where you have to look beyond those numbers that everyone looks to first when they assess growth, which is real GDP, to look at, industrial production, which has been sluggish, labor market, which remains very weak, and just sort of the broader mood, which has been increasingly negative for the past few years in Uruguay due to structural constraints, very high energy costs, high tax burden, ranks as one of the world's most rigid labor markets according to the World Economic Forum. All of those appear to be increasingly binding on the dynamism of the Uruguayan economy.
So I want to pivot a little bit more to the political economy. So as you know, the Frente Amplio just passed a resolution allowing for a free trade agreement with Chile. Although, as you know, it was a very contentious process as the left within the party and the unions were vehemently against it. I wonder what you see the prospects for Uruguay's ability to get more free trade agreements are with the Frente Amplio in power, also with Uruguay being inside Mercosur. And do you see the internal divisions within the Frente Amplio to be a significant veto player for future trade agreements?
I would say so, yes. On one hand, this free trade agreement with Chile is, it happened, it was approved, and it was a breakthrough. It was mostly symbolic. My understanding is that Uruguay and Chile already had fairly favorable access to each other's markets for the sort of things that they're engaged in with each other. So it was much more of a sort of symbolic free trade agreement than one that really stands to provide a broad-based lift to a lot of activities. So the fact that, it was symbolic yet still so contentious makes me think that it would be much more difficult even for free trade agreements with other countries. Uruguay, as part of Mercosur, I think it more or less needs some sort of permission to enter into bilateral agreements. It already had one with Mexico, but for it to do that with China, I think first of all, the veto players within the Frente Amplio could make that exceptionally difficult. And also it could be difficult to pass muster with its Mercosur partners. So, given how difficult it's been to sign free trade agreements, and they just signed this relatively symbolic one with Chile, I would be hesitant to say I'm optimistic about any more free trade agreements under the Frente Amplio.
Right. So this goes to another question, which is the upcoming presidential election in Uruguay. For the first time in 15 years, the Frente Amplio doesn't look like a shoo-in to win. Instead, new outsider candidates like Edgardo Novic and Ernesto Talvi are gaining traction, at least in the media. So how important do you see next year's election? And will a new government be able or willing to take Uruguay in a new direction?
Yeah, it's an early stage, and we're still assessing this. I think broadly speaking, Uruguay is not a country where in any scenario we see any sort of dramatic policy shifts. I think that most importantly, what we're looking at is public finances in Uruguay, which are quite weak, and they seem to be moving in a negative direction. And the election cycle makes it very unlikely that there will be any major adjustments for a whole 2 years until we have a new government in place. But it's not entirely clear how sensitive the fiscal outlook is to who wins the election. I think the Frente Amplio, the Minister Astori, has talked about the need for Social Security reform, and I think there's recognition of that across the political class. But of course, those are always very tricky sort of reforms to enact and they don't yield savings usually right away. They're more of a medium-term issue. On the other hand, the opposition is talking more about reining in spending, but in Uruguay, most of the spending is what they call endogenous. It's pensions, it's Social Security, and healthcare. So very limited room for maneuver in cutting spending. So it's not entirely clear to me that an opposition candidate, if he or she won, would really be able to change the fiscal metrics in a positive direction much more quickly than the Frente Amplio would. But it's an early stage, and we're still waiting to hear more concrete proposals in that area. On other sort of things like structural reforms and everything, I think the opposition is more eager to inject a little bit more competition into certain markets, like the energy market, where the state-owned ANCAP has a monopoly. And, I guess we'll just wait to see what sort of congressional representation they have, if they do win, and don't have a majority, if there's elements of the Frente Amplio they can negotiate with to muster that support. But, all in all, an early stage to assess the likelihood of those sorts of policy changes. But that said, this a country that is gradualist by nature, macroeconomically pretty stable despite some real structural challenges. But, we don't really see the conditions for any sort of major policy shift, likely to be gradual, I think, in any scenario.
Oh, and as you know, in 2003, I believe, there was a referendum against any reform of the energy company. So that's a major consideration for any opposition party.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if Uruguayans today would vote differently on those sorts of issues, but this is certainly an electorate that leans very much to the left. So I don't know if increasing competition in these certain sectors is something that would have a lot of traction with the public, but I guess we'll have to wait and see.
And finally, I just wanted to ask you one more question regarding what is the most important reform you think that any future government must pursue to help Uruguay's economy grow in the next 5 to 10 years?
So, at the rating agencies, we're more macroeconomists than micro. So, we're not really in the weeds on a lot of these micro issues of how countries can grow faster and all of that. But the thing we hear on the micro level is that Uruguay's big structural constraints are cost issues, tax costs, energy costs, and labor costs. And, the world is modernizing technology and all that. A lot of people suggest that some sort of flexibilization to the labor market could be one of the most beneficial things for Uruguay's competitiveness. And that's certainly where it measures up most poorly in a lot of those international indices. Uruguay's human capitals are, already a relative strength relative to the region, but there's been a lot of local concern about education standards having slipped. So even though it stands out as fairly good in that area, that could still be something where important reforms are needed so it can maintain that competitive edge. Those are the micro issues. Like I said, we're not big experts. On the macro, though, Uruguay's big issue is the big fiscal deficit that has grown gradually over the past 5 years due to just structural pressures. There's demographics, flexibilizing the rules around retirement, expanding healthcare. All of those added a lot of pressure on Uruguay's budget. And at one point, they were pledging no tax hikes, but eventually they had to come around to a big tax hike 2 years ago to help pay for some of those. In the end, the deficit's going back to about where it was, despite those tax hikes, because of those spending pressures. So that'll probably the most difficult element facing the next government is how to enact fiscal consolidation. There's very little room left on the tax side, given a lot of those competitiveness pressures I talked about, and given the nature of the budget, highly rigid, it's hard to find exactly where those savings come from. So I think that's why a lot of people across the political class are already talking about the need for Social Security reform, and that'll be a big challenge, I think, under the next government, but one that, we're encouraged is already at least being talked about.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Todd, for your insights on the Uruguayan situation.
Yep, you bet. Happy to speak.
Today's episode was produced, edited, and engineered by Sam Aladef. You can find previous episodes of the Argentina Projects podcast on SoundCloud.
Curious to learn more about Argentina? Subscribe to our newsletter at wilsoncenter.org/weekly-asado.